Make a timeline video, they said. It'll be fun, they said. If you've played and finished Tears of the Kingdom, trying to rationalize a timeline probably has your mind going, well, you're in luck. I've got some thoughts on the concept, but first, we need to answer 3 questions. Are the 2 most recent games a reboot for the series? Does Tears of the Kingdom make the timeline an absolute dumpster fire mess? And do the timelines converge at some point? The answer is simple. Yes. Okay, so how? Rebooting the series sounds like the coward's way out, but I'm no coward. No, I'm courageous enough to lay it all out for you, right here, right now. If theorizing Zelda were an Olympic sport, well, then I'm aiming to take the gold medal in mental gymnastics. Hello and welcome. I'm Wiz. Taking the correct actions at the correct times is what some people would describe as clutch. I call this catching lightning. Like the Link you see in most Zelda games, I'm left-handed, and my favorite color is green. This quality, not my affinity for green, boils down to an ability to engage in more right-brain creative thinking. I have a penchant for seeing patterns in things that I believe are worth noting, and this inspires me to share my observations with you in the form of storytelling. Before jumping into the meat and potatoes of it all, definitely go and check out this video by thinking at max volume, to get a layout of what exactly is going on with time travel in Tears of the Kingdom. This video will act as a supplement to the foundation that he has already laid down for us. In summary, he's provided the time travel theory. I'm providing the lore to support that theory, as well as some speculation of my own. Without going too in-depth, Zelda time travel comes in mostly 2 flavors, and Tears of the Kingdom has both of them. We have flavor number 1. As Sheik stated in Ocarina of Time, the flow of time does not change for any person or timeline. Furthermore, the Master Sword is a ship through time. You can sail upstream and downstream through Time's River, and the port for that ship is the Temple of Time. What does this mean? This means that day 50 in the future is day 50 in the past. Just conveniently forget that the adult and downfall timelines take place 7 years after the child timeline, because that's not as important right now. But this concept explains why Link, when he travels back to the past, he doesn't undo the progress he's already made in that past, like completing the dungeons that he needed to complete in order to acquire the sacred stones to open up the Temple of Time in the first place. This rule is demonstrated when Link delivers the broken Master Sword to the Temple of Time. Quite a bit of time has passed between waking Corpsedorf and Link regaining consciousness up in Skyrule, because this guy delivers the Master Sword to Zelda after she's already lived and experienced the sealing of Ganondorf in the past. What's important to note here is that Zelda gets sent back in time, and then the Master Sword gets sent back to the past sometime later. This confirms that the past and the future exist in the same timeline. If Zelda changed a past that was already written, it would make an alternate timeline of different events, meaning that she would have left her original timeline. Time travel flavor number 2 is that Zelda games can occur in a cycle. Think about the time travel in Skyward Sword. Zelda hibernates in a crystal in order to maintain her seal on Demise. Girahim kidnaps Zelda to bring her back to the past, and resurrects Demise after he's deleted in the present. Demise gets defeated in the past, and then places a curse that will follow the spirit of the hero and the blood of the goddess through a never-ending cycle. What's important to note is that the cycle of time here remains mostly unchanged. The past has to remain unchanged for the future to happen the way it does. This means that the Link and Zelda of Skyward Sword were always in a cycle. Zelda was always in her amber slumber, maintaining her seal on the imprisoned. The ancient cistern was always purifying malice-riddled waters because Demise had already placed his curse, which conquers time, and malice is the physical manifestation of his hatred. Old Impa was always in possession of Zelda's bracelet, as she waited for the completion of Demise's defeat in the ancient past. Words. This leads us to a rising theory made by the channel Thinking at Max Volume. I've spoken with this creator. Really nice guy, by the way. And he's given me permission to use some of his materials for this video, which I intend to do, as I fully support his theory. His theory is that the timelines have all converged. The split timeline happens as it normally would in Ocarina of Time, and it is similar to what people in the Elder Scrolls lore and fandom call a Dragonbreak. 3 timelines exist parallel to each other. Zelda traveling back in time in Tears of the Kingdom makes each timeline unstable, and therefore malleable. This means that the 3 timelines we know about come back together into one, and this one timeline's remembered history is a combination of events from the previous 3 timelines. Going forward, since time has been corrected, it flows as one again. All 3 timelines happen before Tears of the Kingdom, and their histories are not mere legend, but rather they are actual events that occurred, but are remembered differently. There's lore to prove this. The ceremony at the beginning of Breath of the Wild acknowledges a specific chronology of events. At the beginning of the game, Link is given an accolade as Zelda's chosen hero, as the two are surrounded by the champions. Zelda mentions an acknowledged history of events. She says, "Whether skyward bound, adrift in time, or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight." Here, she is acknowledging the events that took place from Skyward Sword to Twilight Princess. She's recalling events from before and during the child timeline. The Japanese version of this cutscene gives us complementary information. In addition to what Zelda says, Daruk and Revali also recite the following: "Crossing the seas, when seeking the gold made by the gods, may you be alongside the hero." In the Japanese version of Breath of the Wild, the game is referencing all 3 timelines. In other words, both versions of the same game collectively acknowledge all 3 timelines. In Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, we have the item description of rock salt as well as the existence of the Rito, a tribe that is introduced in Wind Waker. Both of these allude to an adult timeline. We also have the existence of Hinoxes and Lynels, which can only be found in the Downfall timeline. Let's take it even further with location names. Considered to be Easter eggs, there's a location in reference to just about every Zelda game in existence. The Breach of Demise acknowledges that the events of Skyward Sword took place, or how else would there be a name associated with the arrival of the original Demon King at a location that depicts a schism in the ground? Lake Kolomo references the Lokomo tribe from Spirit Tracks. Spectacle Rock references A Link to the Past. Arbiter's Grounds calls back to Twilight Princess. The list goes on. Heck, even the location of the Lost Woods is in the one-for-one location that it would be in A Link to the Past. The original Temple of Time and Lon Lon Ranch are located in the locations they would have been in Ocarina of Time. This demonstrates not just a shared history of all the previous timelines, but even an amalgamation of all existing game maps from every Zelda game before Breath of the Wild. The time travel event in Tears of the Kingdom led to the history and reality that has fused all timelines together. It's equally important to remember that the 4 divine beasts are named after 4 sages from the Zelda franchise's history from separate timelines as well. Amiibo items from Breath of the Wild are now even buried in the depths, or littered throughout Hyrule, to further support this claim. These items aren't replicas either. Well, except for the Dark Link outfit, but I digress. The takeaway is that the timeline before Ocarina of Time is alluded to, and so are the 3 timelines that come after Ocarina of Time. It's important to note that Zelda is labeled as the Sage of Time in only 2 Zelda games, Ocarina of Time and Tears of the Kingdom. These are the only 2 games when Zelda directly causes time travel. In Skyward Sword, she's more of a passenger traveling through time with the help of the Gate of Time. She's also following a predetermined path set in motion by the goddess Hylia. In Ocarina of Time, using her sage powers, Zelda sends Link back to the past before she ever meets him, and this causes the infamous timeline split. When Zelda directly causes time travel, she unintentionally breaks time, like we see in both Ocarina of Time and Tears of the Kingdom. This is why we don't see the last 3 murals at the beginning of Tears of the Kingdom. It's not because Zelda changes the future, it's because this always happens, and Zelda knowing the past would alter the future. This would also spoil the story for the player. In Tears of the Kingdom, she engages with Rauru's secret stone, which unlocks her sage abilities, sending her to the past. These are the only 2 examples in the franchise where Zelda directly causes time travel using her sage powers. This is an infographic of surface level information. It's easy to see a sequence of events with this timeline, which are fairly straightforward. This demonstrates how all of the events play out and merge the timeline. Let's go a bit deeper. This image displays tiered timelines all within the infinite expanse of time. It looks like a staircase because it technically does not end. It's a perpetual cycle, where the beginning of one cycle, that is to say Zelda traveling back into the past, brings about the past that leads to that future. If I were to give you a concept from the Zelda series, this would be similar to the Song of Storms from Ocarina of Time. Did Link teach the song, or did he learn the song? It's a paradox. One thing's for certain, this guy's pissed. The future that always will be leads to the past that always was, which leads to the future that always will be. Again, words. If we were to depict this as a three-dimensional image, it would be a spring, just like a causal spring. But I'm going to call it a spiral, because if you look at the causal spring from top down, it looks exactly like a spiral, with the center of the spiral being the starting point of Zelda's time travel. We see a spiral shape in a lot of Zelda games. It's in Skyward Sword in the Faron Forest. It's on the Gate of Time. It's the Zonai symbol. This event that's being depicted looks like a convergence on paper, with the events of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom representing a single point on a two-dimensional line. And it is. But it actually looks like this. The spiral you see here is the convergence point at the end of the three timelines, closing the Dragonbreak, which started at the end of Ocarina of Time, leading all of the way to the ending of Tears of the Kingdom, or what you see in this two-dimensional image. The parallel timelines are the entirety of the Zelda franchise. Infinite copies, all existing together, but occurring at different points in time, in relation to each other. This spiral is the never-ending cycle that each Zelda must go through in order to unify all three timelines. This journey through time is what corrects the timeline, leading to one that is neatly packaged and nowhere near as complicated. And here's the final product of how this would look with a condensed infinite time loop. This is the spiral-shaped cycle that is happening. Please, take some time to digest this image before continuing. Keep in mind that this took yours truly the duration of one full Zelda spiral to conceptualize. So there's no shame in letting it process in your mind. What's important to note is that two Master Swords exist at the same time during this cycle. You'll want to remember this for later. Alright, so now that you know what the convergence is, when does the heckin' thing happen? The convergence has to deal with the history of Tears of the Kingdom, and we'll need to determine when that history takes place. There are currently three popular schools of thought. Before Skyward Sword, after Skyward Sword but before Ocarina of Time, or after Ocarina of Time, but before Breath of the Wild. Several people have speculated that the history of Tears of the Kingdom takes place before Skyward Sword. This is the most easily disproved theory. The condemning evidence is Fi. Fi speaks to Zelda in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Zelda even acknowledges Fi towards the end of Tears of the Kingdom by using the pronoun she in this cutscene.
Link. The Master Sword. Your sword. She is the key to destroying the Demon King.
But the first time Fi speaks is in Skyward Sword, which is after the goddess Hylia created the sword. So that just logically can't happen. What also can't logically happen is Ganondorf existing before Demise. Ganondorf is a reincarnation of Demise, and not the other way around. Several people have said that Demise's scar accurately reflects where Ganondorf has the secret stone placed on his headdress in Tears of the Kingdom. But that puts the cart before the horse. I mean, have you seen every single Ganondorf? They all have headdresses. Demise has a scar because Hylia placed a sealing spike on his head and sealed him away as the imprisoned at the end of their final battle. Ganondorf's motif of always having a headdress symbolizes where Demise's sealing spike scar would be, and not the other way around. Demise is also the source of all demons. Up until Tears of the Kingdom, Ganondorf has never generated demons. For these reasons, among others, we can rule out Tears of the Kingdom's history taking place before Skyward Sword. The second theory that Tears of the Kingdom's history is placed right after Skyward Sword but before Ocarina of Time seems like the best answer for its placement. I personally love this theory. I mean, it fits so perfectly right here in the timeline. Rauru and Sonia say that they are the founding king and queen of Hyrule, as far as they know, and we know Rauru created the Temple of Time. I'll argue in favor of this theory. How can there be two Ganondorfs at once? The Japanese have a word for this, and that word is Tamashii. A Tamashii functions similarly to a soul. In fact, it is a soul. And it can even leave its host if that host dies or is incapacitated, or even sealed. There's a notion in Japanese culture that a Tamashii can exist in two hosts simultaneously, much like how two candles can share the same flame. We've seen this before in the Zelda series, with the Link of Twilight Princess and the Hero Shade, two hosts who share the same spirit of the hero. This can explain how Ganondorf can be imprisoned beneath Hyrule Castle, while Ganondorf Dragmire is out and about, causing all sorts of mischief. Look at this cutscene here with Ganondorf in Hyrule Castle, paralleling the same event that happened in Ocarina of Time. See the two short-haired Gerudo behind him? When you translate the letters on their sashes, you derive the names Kome and totk, who were the witches known for raising Ganondorf Dragmire. Let's guesstimate that their age is at around 30 or so, just for kicks and giggles. Alright, now what do Kome and totk say when Link defeats them in the Spirit Temple in Ocarina of Time? They argue about their age as they pass into the afterlife. They debate that they are either 380, but most likely 400 years old. Let's settle on them being 400 years old. This would mean that the events of Tears of the Kingdom's history are around 370 years before the events of Ocarina of Time. Sounds legit, right? I know, and I want it to be, but that fruit hangs too low for me. I'm going to reason why the Convergence and the history of Tears of the Kingdom take place after the Dragonbreak Convergence, but thousands of years before the events of Breath of the Wild. And it starts with the Rito. The existence of the Rito could make sense in an early post-Skyward Sword timeline. We know this because a kami like Valoo can accelerate the evolution of the Zora from freshwater creatures to flying Rito in less than 100 years, when Hyrule becomes flooded with saltwater. But the Rito share the traits of both Loftwings and the Zora, and the Rito came into existence officially in Wind Waker. Yes, I'm aware of several nitpicks, like the mural art depicting Rito from an artist who allegedly felt like making art depicting the inclusion of the Rito in Twilight Princess HD, but the point is that we don't see the Rito until Wind Waker, and not a moment before Wind Waker in the chronology of events in the Zelda Timeline. The Zora had a forced evolution in this timeline, because salt water would have killed them. For a perfect example of this, look at the lineage of Tulin. Tulin has Loftwing eyes. They're the eyes of his mother, Saki. Now look at Tulin's father, Teba. Compare the eyes of Teba and Saki. Their eyes are noticeably different. Now look at Sidon's eyes. Do his eyes look familiar? They look like Teba's eyes. Knowing that the Rito evolved from the Zora, with both tribes existing in mutually exclusive timelines, we begin to support the idea of a timeline convergence, as the Zora exist in other timelines, and the eyes of Tulin's parents, along with the eyes of Sidon, are demonstrative of this lineage. This suggests a merging of lineages and timelines with respect to the timelines of Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild onward. This can explain how a tribe like the Rito, which were isolated to the adult timeline, can exist alongside their freshwater ancestors, the Zora, and why the history of Tears of the Kingdom can include representatives of both tribes as sages, who supported Rauru during the imprisoning war of Ganondorf. Let's look at the Gerudo again. The Gerudo of Ocarina of Time have noticeable differences from the Gerudo of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The Gerudo of Ocarina of Time have round ears and topaz-colored eyes. Ganondorf Dragmire has round ears and topaz eyes. Ganondorf acquires the Triforce of Power in Ocarina of Time, and his ears become pointed. This explains why Ganondorf of Twilight Princess and Wind Waker both have pointed ears. Being in possession of the Triforce of Power allegedly made our villain closer to the gods, or so it's been widely speculated. The Gerudo of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have emerald eyes and pointed ears, which was an indication of the tribe wanting to distinguish themselves from the likeness of the Ganondorf that became the Calamity, as indicated by this quote here. Now, I'm going to speculate here and say that the name of the Gerudo sage who partook in the sealing of the Ganondorf who became the Calamity was named Naboru, who would be this lass with the mask. Because just like Rauru shares the same name as this guy, I'm going to take some poetic license here and assume that this sage's name is also Naboru. Because reincarnation in Zelda be like that sometimes, and it would take me an entirely separate video to explain that to you. So for now, I'll ask that you suspend your disbelief. The Ganondorf of Tears of the Kingdom has round ears and topaz eyes. Genetically speaking, we could call this a sex-linked recessive trait, like men who inherit color blindness from their mothers. And when only one male is born every 100 years to this tribe, there isn't enough room to deviate from that genetic outcome. Symbolically, however, we can explain that Ganondorf is this way because his likeness resembles the previous Ganondorf before him, who would be Ganondorf Dragmire. He's a reincarnation of the G-Man who came before him. It's worth mentioning that Rauru acknowledges that a Gerudo male is born every 100 years. In the quote I've shown you, it is also said that there wasn't another male Gerudo leader after the Ganondorf who became the Calamity. This means that this Ganondorf could not have been born before Ganondorf Dragmire, if Dragmire were the source of the Calamity. Biologically speaking, the Gerudo aren't just going to evolve the dominant trait of pointed ears and green eyes, only to regress in evolution back to round ears and topaz eyes. That disobeys the laws of genetics. And Gregor Mendel and Charles Darwin would rise from the dead faster than you can say the word re-dead in disbelief over it. Let's take a stroll through the Great Plateau. The Great Plateau is where Rauru and Sonia's castle was. It's also where the Temple of Time was constructed. Wait a second. How are there two Temples of Time? Especially when Rauru and Sonia founded Hyrule, as far as they know. If this isn't your first time on my channel, I've said before that Hyrule's history doesn't repeat itself. It does, however, like to rhyme, like poetry. For example, consider the war that Hylia and Demise were engaged in involved sealing Demise away as the imprisoned. While it's not directly mentioned, we could have easily called this war the Imprisoning War based on its outcome. And you're already aware of the two legitimate imprisoning wars mentioned from both A Link to the Past and Tears of the Kingdom. Who's to say that there wasn't a previous imprisoning war of sorts that doesn't share the same title of the two we know about, but rather a similar sequence of events? In the prologue of Skyward Sword, Hylia raised Skyloft into the sky, and she must have had sages involved, or at least sages were acknowledged with the symbols of the sage medallions that we can see at the top of Skyloft Temple. A parallel to this event is mentioned in Tears of the Kingdom, when Link completes a certain side quest at the top of the Temple of Time. In Skyrule, when a Zonai construct mentions that Zelda did the same with Rauru's sages. There's even a shield that Lanayru gives Link in Skyward Sword with the Hylian royal crest on it. How does that happen without a Kingdom of Hyrule having already been founded? Did the shield warp back in time from before the kingdom was founded? These questions are valid. Yes, Zelda and Link decided to descend and live in Hyrule at the end of Skyward Sword, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they founded it, especially when the crest of the royal family exists before they've ever established a kingdom. The validity of Rauru and Sonia founding the Kingdom of Hyrule for the first time can be similarly called into question in terms of the validity of their shared statement. I'll tell you something cool about the etymology of Sonia's name. Sonia's name is said to mean wisdom, which is half true. The Greek word for wisdom is sophos. That's where we get the name Sophia. I believe Sonia's name truly derives from the Greek word sonos, which means sound. And this makes sense in a post-Ocarina of Time converged timeline, as the plot of Tears of the Kingdom echoes all of the games that come before it. Before the arrival of the Zonai, there was probably yet another collapse of history in the Kingdom of Hyrule. This would have reverted society in Hyrule back to tribal communities. When the Zonai came down, order would have been re-established. This explains why the Hyruleans look like Aztec warriors, and why they have symbols painted on them. Notice how Sonia has the Triforce painted on her, but the Triforce is never spoken about. If the Triforce became a sealing power that is passed on from generation to generation, this explains why the Triforce is never directly mentioned in either Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, and why Ganondorf has no prior knowledge of the Triforce. Instead, he notices the Secret Stones, which act as a stand-in for the Triforce, as the object of power sought after by Ganondorf in this game. Rauru is not infallible. He's certainly capable of making mistakes, because he's not omniscient, he's not all-knowing. I can provide two examples of when Rauru was wrong. The first is when Rauru believes that he can keep Ganondorf in check by keeping him close to the kingdom under his control after their war. This seems like a good idea, right? The second time Rauru gets it wrong is when he says that Zelda appeared from a future that doesn't involve her already having traveled to his past. If that were the case, well then how do we explain how Korpsdorf recognizes Zelda and Link when they first discover his body at the beginning of Tears of the Kingdom? Zelda had to have already traveled to the past in order for this to happen. This is what leads me to believe that Rauru is wrong about having founded the Kingdom of Hyrule for the first time in Hyrule's history. Again, Hyrule's history rhymes and echoes through time instead of perfectly repeating itself. Alright, this is where the full speculation begins, but this plays into exactly how the timelines converge, which leads us to this rebooted yet echoed and unified timeline from Breath of the Wild onward. The Zonai have a forbidden ritual of draconification, where if an individual swallows a secret stone, they lose themselves and become an immortal dragon. The transformation is said to be irreversible. There are 3 dragons that we know about in Breath of the Wild, the dragons Dinral, Naydra, and Farosh. Is it too much of a stretch to surmise that these dragons used to be Zonai, and that the forbidden lesson was learned in order to not repeat their mistakes? In Eastern religions, specifically Buddhism and Shintoism, escaping the endless cycle of death and rebirth doesn't involve being morally good. It involves detaching oneself from all human emotions, because emotions keep one's soul bound to the mortal existence of samsara, the endless cycle of reincarnation. Zelda ingests her secret stone and becomes the immortal dragon of light. As a side note, the reason we don't see Zelda in Breath of the Wild would be because she goes above the cloud barrier in this scene, and she's conveniently out of sight for that entire game. In a way, Zelda achieves godly immortality, and effectively becomes a deity of sorts, as dragons are perceived as gods in both ancient Japan and Tears of the Kingdom lore. Thought experiment time. Let's assume that with the precedence of how Link had the Triforce inside of him during Skyward Sword, Zelda also had the Triforce inside of her in Breath of the Wild, and it's labeled as the sealing power. Let's assume that she still has the Triforce with her when she travels back in time. Let's assume that when Zelda transforms into the Dragon of Light, that she forges the Master Sword, in a way. She doesn't create it for the first time, but she gives it new life. Finally, let's assume that at the very end of Tears of the Kingdom, Zelda sheds her divinity, with her sealing power intact, and the Master Sword complete. What would you call her dragon form? What name would you give it? I would call that Dragon of Light Hylia. Zelda's journey through time as a dragon, and the three dragons who came before her, allude to the creation myth of the Golden Goddesses from the Zelda franchise's ancient history. In Zelda having the Triforce within her and recreating the Master Sword reflects the story of Hylia safeguarding the Triforce and creating the Master Sword, but also not being able to use the Triforce, because when you become a god, when you become a dragon, you lose your sense of self. Another great tidbit is that the spirits of Rauru and Sonia, the former sages of light and time, channel their energy through Link as he is balanced in all virtues at the end of Tears of the Kingdom, and this is what transforms Zelda back into her Hyrulean form. Where's the Triforce found in Ocarina of Time? It's found in the Sacred Realm, which you can only get to at the interstice between the Temple of Time and the Temple of Light. This would make Zelda a literal, anthropomorphic, sacred realm. This could explain a perplexing climax that many fans chalked up as poor writing from Nintendo. And Zelda, having both the Triforce and the Master Sword, in addition to creating a never-ending spiral that breaks time, is what I believe caused the convergence of all timelines into one timeline. Because during her journey, she has the Triforce within her the entire time. The Master Sword arrives sometime later, which supports that the history before Breath of the Wild was never altered, but always was. During this time travel, there are two Triforces and two Master Swords simultaneously. We know this because of the calamity from 10,000 years before Breath of the Wild. In Tears of the Kingdom, if you speak with Impa while wearing the ancient aspect armor, you'll gain an extra bit of dialogue where she mentions the royal princess who used the sealing power and the ancient hero who was chosen by the legendary sword. If you know anything about the Master Sword, you know that it chooses who wields it. The Zelda figure in this mural is using the sacred power of the Triforce alongside the ancient aspect hero, so reality would be forced to correct itself because of this series of conflicting realities, creating a converged timeline with a shared history of the timelines that came before it. So, what do you think? Do you agree or disagree, and why? Do you have any additional information that you would like to share to add to this conversation? Comment below. If you liked this video and you want to see more, don't forget to Triforce a click on those like and subscribe buttons, because they really do help me out, and I greatly appreciate it. As usual, some thanks are in order. A special thank you to Thinking at Max Volume for replying to my tweet and helping me review this script to make it sound as coherent as possible. I couldn't have made this video without your help, man. And thank you to LoruleanHistorian for helping me with Japanese translation. This has been Wiz. I'm gonna go catch some lightning. I'll see you in the next one.